Please welcome Isaac.
Thanks for that, Saib. All right, just realised I'd lost my full screen and I don't know if that's coming back. Well, anyway, I'm going to keep going. I'm trying to use slide dev for the first time, so already hitting a rough patch. Cool. I started my career working here with Telstra Purple about 5 years ago now, a little over 5 years. And in that time, I've had the incredible fortune to work on quite a large number of projects now, across a various number of domains and with more than just a small handful of technologies. One of the recurring technologies I use is .NET. Very infrequently have I worked on a project that didn't use it in some capacity, and more often than not, an API component was part of what we were building. Now, every one of those projects has followed loosely the same structure, and every time it's been effective. It works, we're all familiar with it, and it gets the job done. But I don't love it. And I say this as someone who loves writing code. Call it a prolonged honeymoon phase or outright delusion, if you will, but I do enjoy writing code, and it bothers me when things just feel a little bit off. FastEndpoints is a library for .NET that I stumbled across recently, and when it comes to building an API, it rekindled some of that dwindling love that I had for the practice. Where I realized I was starting to groan a little bit internally whenever I had to add a new endpoint, and we were adding a bunch of files and folders were coming up all over the place as we added handlers. FastEndpoints instead had me picking the laptop up again on a Saturday morning. My cricket team wasn't too happy when I turned up late to a game that Saturday, but I was enjoying it again, and I wanted to share that with you all today. FastEndpoints is, in its own words, a developer-friendly alternative to minimal APIs and MVC. Ultimately, it just offers us a different way to structure our code. Nothing under the hood is fundamentally different to any large degree, mostly just providing a friendly wrapper around much of the technology that we already use today when we're building our APIs. And there's a big question in why. Is there even anything wrong with the way we're doing things now? And while the way we do things does work, I've never been able to shake this feeling that we often make things more complicated than it needs to be. Ultimately though, it was a developer-friendly claim that really dragged me in, and actually seeing how the endpoints looked in practice made me sit up and pay attention. One of the things that I've frequently observed across multiple projects now is a tendency to jump straight into heavy abstractions and moving bits of code everywhere to fit into particular layers. While I don't find the current landscape of API development in .NET to be off-putting by any stretch, it often feels like it's just a little bit more than it needs to be. FastEndpoints was something I discovered almost by accident. I was half watching YouTube while laying in bed one night, and something about a particular video jumped out at me. I was still thinking about it the next day, so I went back and I rewatched it with a bit more intent. And at the risk of bringing up something that is well and truly not .NET related, anybody who's worked with me over the last couple of years knows I'm quite a fan of SvelteKit. In particular, the ease of development that it brings. It's very simple to use. It's a framework that I want to use, that I want to work with, and it does make my work enjoyable. And right off the bat, FastEndpoints was hitting those same notes. It offered a similar no-nonsense, cohesive approach to building APIs in .NET. That said, however, much like SvelteKit, it felt doomed to just live in the shadows of the status quo. I didn't think too many people would be keen to move away from the tried and true MediatR patterns that I'd seen used in 90% of the projects that I'd worked on. And then all of a sudden, MediatR went commercial. So the commercialization of MediatR gave me a very compelling reason to go back and give FastEndpoints a really good assessment. I wanted to see if it could actually slot into our typical projects and not just replace MediatR, but improve the overall developer experience. I hadn't really sat down and tried to figure out exactly what it was that I didn't quite like about the way we were doing things. For the most part, it did all work and it all made sense. But I was still pretty green when I first came across those patterns. And honestly, it was all I could do at that time to just keep up, let alone question anything. And very quickly became the comfortable, established way to do things, even if sometimes it felt a little cumbersome to hold. Now, most people are going to be at least somewhat familiar with a diagram similar to this one. In a typical application, particularly one using DDD, we would aim to separate our code into presentation, application, domain, and infrastructure layers, which is great, and we're all used to that. Still, there are a lot of moving parts that can make things feel a little bit overwhelming. I'll quickly run through those moving parts, mostly just to put a lot of busy arrows on the screen to make it look as terrible as possible. So we have our presentation layer, which is responsible for the request and response DTOs, serialization, returning errors, etc. Then we have queries and commands housed in our application layer, along with our handlers. Our handlers are then in turn responsible for reaching into the domain and infrastructure layers, and essentially coordinating the business logic for our application. Then we throw MediatR into the mix, gluing together our commands and queries to the respective handlers, which are then responsible for outputting a result that can be turned into a response DTO. Assuming, of course, that we haven't just exposed those DTOs to the handlers themselves to make our lives easier. Ultimately, what I've observed is that with this many moving parts, that a disproportionate amount of code ends up in the handlers. While there's a fair amount of speculation at play, I consider this to be the result of having too many places to put our code. We make the decisions hard for ourselves, and we make code cumbersome to write. And so we cut corners when we find the easiest place to put code. And more often than not, I see this presented as the handlers in our application layer becoming the god of all of our logic. Almost invariably, I've seen them being made aware of or even owning the request and response DTOs. And honestly, I don't mind this one all that much. It's pragmatic. But that said, it's still increasing the surface area for disagreement. The thing I've noticed that doesn't sit well with me, however, is that quite often I see what should be domain logic ending up in our handlers. Allowing that domain logic to bleed into our application layer undermines the value of encapsulating all that business logic into one single area of the code base. It becomes hard to find those business rules as they're scattered amongst handlers and entities. Working with our system can quickly become inconsistent and error-prone. In most projects, I've seen this normalized combination of the domain and application layers to result in explicitly moving the application code into the domain. Very few of the projects that I've worked on have actually maintained the distinction between the two. Largely, they've all been reduced to presentation, domain, and infrastructure layers. Typically, this has resulted in very thin controllers, thin wrappers around our database or our services, and then a very busy domain project which is doing pretty much everything. Especially when we combine this with the approach of allowing our application layer to be aware of and mapping to and from our response and request DTOs, all of a sudden we have elements of our presentation layer making their way into the domain. So even when things are kept relatively clean, we're relying on individual developers to maintain boundaries instead of putting these guardrails in place for ourselves. FastEndpoints, on the other hand, looks to flip this relationship around by moving the application logic into the presentation layer. That temptation to slide just a little bit more code into an already busy handler that's already doing all the things anyway kind of goes away. At the very least, it gives us a very simple decision to make. Is this domain logic or isn't it? It becomes an either-or choice. We're not busying up our thoughts with wondering where we're going to put these DTOs or how we're going to map to and from them. Now, of course, there's a very real concern that in a typical controller setup, or if we're using minimal APIs, that we're going to have a bunch of routes inside a single class. And if we're talking about moving all of that application code into our presentation layer, that's going to get messy very quickly. FastEndpoints addresses this by pushing us into a single endpoint per class approach. Conceptually, our presentation layer becomes a code that describes our route, and our application layer is covered by the handler for that endpoint. And what I found is that by pushing a lot of the code right up to the presentation layer, it gives us the mental room to think a bit more critically about whether the code we're adding could actually belong in the domain layer. So our typical controller gets broken up into a bunch of separate endpoint classes. The request comes in, gets mapped to an endpoint, we execute the code in our handler and spit out the result. And there's a very valid question that can be asked here, and that is, can't we just do that ourselves? And yeah, we can. It's not too difficult to register a bunch of different endpoints in different files. And then we've kind of addressed that whole problem that I was talking about and avoided the need to introduce an additional dependency. FastEndpoints does have a few bells and whistles, however, and I think it offers enough that it's absolutely worth considering over using bare bones minimal API or using controllers. At a very high level, and starting from the least specific to FastEndpoints, but still a noteworthy benefit, there is a very strong encouragement of the use of vertical slices. Personally, this one ticks off a bit of an annoyance of mine with regards to the typical architecture that I've encountered, where implementing a basic feature or even slightly modifying some code needs us to open a bunch of files across different projects. FastEndpoints also introduces some opinionated ways of doing things. So while there are some options on how to hold parts of it, for the most part, it feels like there is a right way to do things. Couple that with FastEndpoints' concise implementations, and that surface area for disagreement on written code is far lower. And the thing that we're going to dive into in a bit more detail is the various features that FastEndpoints offers straight out of the box that really make working with it quite a pleasurable experience. First off, we'll have a quick look at the basic structure of an endpoint compared to what I've usually run into. On the left here, we've got a pretty basic view of the sort of architecture that I've often run into. All of these files would typically be required to implement a single basic feature. In this case, grabbing a user from a database. We've got our API project and our DTOs, controllers, all grouped together. And then in our application layer, we've got our queries and our handlers all mixed in with one another. Of course, there's the user entity in the database, so the DB context, but those remain the same across both implementations, so we won't bother with those. Now, naturally, as a project grows, it becomes quite hard to navigate and find specific handlers, endpoints, and DTOs when they're all mixed in with one another. As our business logic increases in complexity, we end up with handlers calling other handlers with no sense of visible hierarchy, and it can quickly turn into a tangled mess that's very difficult to work with. The vertical slice architecture encouraged by FastEndpoints comprises of a single endpoint or feature. Typically, these follow established naming conventions, and I fully understand that that may not be everybody's cup of tea, and we are free to call those classes really whatever we want, but this does reflect the type of example you will see, not just in this presentation, but out in the wild as well. So anyway, thanks to namespaces, if we do adopt this convention, we end up with a series of files that very explicitly describe what they do consistently across every endpoint. So looking at our overall structure, we'll focus on the implementation of a very basic endpoint before we start diving into the other features. There is some registration that we need to do in our program.cs, but it's really nothing surprising there, so we won't look at that. Starting with the most basic endpoint possible, we need to create a class which inherits from endpoint without request. This is the simplest of the base endpoint classes, used when we have neither a request nor response DTO. To configure the endpoint, we simply need to override the configure method. Here we can use one of FastEndpoint's helper methods to register our route, with the example here using the get method to, surprisingly, register a HTTP get route. As might be expected, calling post would register a post route and so forth. We can also call other helper methods here, such as allow anonymous. A little quirk of FastEndpoints is that it requires authorization for all endpoints by default. If that's not desired, we can configure that globally in our program.cs, so we can change this, but it's just something to be aware of. Helper methods are also available to describe the endpoint, or even configure cores on a per endpoint basis. We can also enhance our Swagger documentation through the summary method. And if we want to avoid cluttering up our endpoints, we can move that code out into a separate class that inherits from summary, just passing the endpoint in as a type parameter. That automatically gets registered to the endpoint, so there's no need to go wiring things up manually in our DI container. Coming back to our basic endpoint, we still needed a place to put our handler code, and we do this by overriding the handle async method. Essentially, this is where we would put the code that would otherwise live in our application layer. Of course, nothing is stopping us from simply passing this off to a MediatR pipeline at this point, but my opinion is that that really undermines the value of being able to have this one file that just contains all of our endpoint code. So marking this as async allows us to return a response by calling one of the helper methods here. In this case, we're using send OK async, which returns a 200 status code. So FastEndpoints offers quite a few convenience methods here. I won't list them all, but we have some options such as send not found async or send forbidden async. And they do very much what they say on the label. Now, the first gotcha that I encountered with FastEndpoints came up here. So using a wait here led me to think that I could potentially execute some code after the response had been sent. Now, I found in practice that wasn't quite the case. And to prevent that from misleading devs, we can use an alternative. So the execute async method allows us to specify a strict return type for the method, which brings implementation a little closer to what we're typically used to. And as with minimal API, we can also use the results union type to allow for multiple possible return values. Ultimately though, this comes down to a trade-off between adding those guardrails for ourselves and using those really expressive helper methods. We'll focus now on the first line here, where we can see we've passed a return type to endpoint without request. This is a good segue into the different types of base classes that we can inherit from when we're building an endpoint. We started by inheriting from endpoint without request with no type parameter. As mentioned earlier, this is what we use when we have neither a request nor response DTO. By passing in a type for our response, we're now describing an endpoint with no request DTO, but with a response DTO. Inheriting from the endpoint class expects that we provide a type for the request DTO, and optionally we can pass in a type for the response DTO if we're returning one. And once we've got our request object, we can pass it into the handle async method and start using it in our handler code, which brings us nicely to the topic of model binding. So our endpoint is going to be supplied with a fully populated request DTO with the property values having been automatically bound from multiple sources. Focusing on our models file here, this will typically contain both our request and response DTOs, but we'll focus on the request object in particular as the response is just a stock standard DTO which we can new up in the handler and then return. The exact order of sources that can populate these properties are as can be seen here. And as a request moves through the list of binding sources, we essentially take the value from the last in the list that matches, with a slight catch with those three requiring an explicit attribute. As a simple example, given a post request to users/2 with a body that specifies a different ID, we'll use the value from the route parameter instead of that from the JSON body. So closely related to model binding, we also get validation straight out of the box with FastEndpoints using fluent validation rules. Typically, this ends up in our models file, although I'm not a fan of squeezing too many different classes into a single file, and I tend to actually break this one out because I'm just not a big fan of it. But we'll stick to this because it does seem to be what most examples do. So similar to where we had the option to move our endpoint summary out of the endpoint file itself, we can do the same thing by passing the endpoint as a type parameter to a class inheriting from validator. And we don't need to register that manually with our DI container. Now, validation failures will be returned automatically if any of these rules fail that validation check, which is nice and succinct for the simple cases, but we can build on top of this if we have any business logic to consider. So coming back to our endpoint class, we can tell FastEndpoints to not automatically send a validation failed response by calling don't throw if validation fails. Yeah, pretty self-explanatory, that one. Calling add error adds an error to the aggregated list. So this allows us to provide a response that contains all of our errors to save on those multiple requests that only serve to discover more errors. This alone here isn't actually enough to return an error. So while FastEndpoints does give us a more explicit way to return such a failure, the easiest way to just stop execution of our handler code is to simply call throw if any errors. That will interrupt our handler execution and send a response with all of our aggregated errors, by default with an overridable 400 status code. Now we can see here that we've also introduced the use of a service, in this case a DB context. Injecting this is straightforward, just needing to be injected via the constructor. In addition to any explicitly injected services, FastEndpoints automatically resolve some services for us. Every endpoint by default has access to the configuration, a logger, and the web host environment. Most examples also make use of a separate data class, a separate data file to house any data access or manipulation. And while there's likely far less value in moving this logic around if we're making use of a repository pattern or if we have fairly simple queries, it can be useful for moving large blocks of code out of our handler. And again, while it's not going to appeal to everyone, this does seem to be the common approach, and it does give us a really nice, concise, and expressive handler endpoint once we've moved those chunky queries out of there. And the last thing we'll cover in terms of a basic endpoint are the wrappers that FastEndpoints gives us around mapping to and from our request and response DTOs. A mapper file is often introduced, which holds some code that simply maps to and from our entity. I'll shrink those down to give us a little bit of extra room to work with. And in the case of our request to entity mapping, it gives us the ability to simply call toEntity to convert our request into the target entity. For response mapping, we simply do the inverse of this and call fromEntity. FastEndpoints also gives us a sendMapped method that we can use to return the mapped response DTO. And again, a lot of this is down to personal choice, and I tend to lean away from that and just construct them myself inside the handler code. But it is still a nice option to have. So we've got a nice expressive way to write our endpoints, and it cuts down on a large amount of that boilerplate. By keeping all of our code closely grouped together, it lets us start as simply as possible. We can declare a single endpoint and easily extend functionality to those supporting classes as we find the need to. That said, so far all we've really done is wrap a few helper methods around minimal API and moved our application layer to our presentation layer. And honestly, if it stopped here, I'd probably consider it not worth the risk of leaning on yet another dependency. But there are still a few tricks up FastEndpoint's sleeve that do make it quite an interesting choice. Now, first up, anyone familiar with MediatR has probably used its pre and post processes or pipeline behaviors at some point. FastEndpoints has an equivalent offering here, which allows us to run code before or after the endpoint is executed. Where FastEndpoints implementation differs from MediatR is that in FastEndpoints, it wraps the endpoint execution itself, not just a single handler, and it doesn't provide a full middleware-like pattern the way a pipeline behavior would with MediatR. We do, however, have the ability to share state between all the stages of this pipeline, although the implementation can at times feel a little clunky to hold. And that's largely due to us needing to use an additional state object to share any values between processes, which isn't really much of a concern in itself, but we are limited to having only one object registered per request, which means anything that we need to add to that, we just need to be able to tack onto that object, which just feels a little off at times. We'll see an example here, however, that shows how state can be accessed by various parts of the overall request pipeline. First, our preprocessor initializes a class that represents our state, in this case to track some execution times. And flow progresses to our endpoint, where we can access that state object and, for example, attach some timings for specific actions. This example uses a response interceptor, which is another feature of FastEndpoints, and it is required in this case as FastEndpoints runs the post processes after the response has already been sent. So if we need to add any headers or we need to modify the response, it needs to be done here. And then lastly, our post processor picks up the same state object and logs the execution times. And as mentioned, that clunkiness comes here when we wanted to add anything to that state object. For example, we could have a preprocessor that provides a it goes and looks up a user and then provides that to the endpoints. And we would have to add that user to the existing state class if we wanted to access that. Now the example here is for a specific endpoint, and each endpoint that wants to run either of these processes needs to add them in their respective configure methods. We can, however, just as easily register these as global pre or post processes. I always stumble over that. They do need to be carefully configured though if we do need to execute those in a particular order. And we do have some overrides to the methods that let us specify that. Now, if we're feeling particularly nostalgic, FastEndpoints allows for that familiar mediator-like handler pattern as well. This allows for what is a very simple starting point to organically grow into a solution that's more reminiscent of our typical mediator-based solutions. Or perhaps we just want to extract some common logic without necessarily wrapping it all in a service. FastEndpoints commands and events reflect mediator's request and response pattern, as well as their notifications pattern. With events essentially being a one-to-many fire and forget operations, while commands have a one-to-one relationship with handlers and may return a result. We also have the ability to queue up commands to be run in the background, useful for those long-running tasks where we don't want to block a user's interaction with a web page. So raising events in FastEndpoints is pretty straightforward. We create an event inside an endpoint and publish it with publish async. Any event handlers with that event provided as its type parameter will be invoked, and we can wait for any one of our handlers to complete execution, or we can wait for all of them, or we can wait for none. Events can also be invoked from outside of an endpoint if required by having our event class implement iEvent, which exposes a publish async method on the event itself. Commands are likewise straightforward to implement at the basic level, providing us with a request response pipeline to a single handler. We simply call execute async on our command, which will invoke the handler and optionally return a result. We can also call add error at this point to append to the error context, which will add the error to the aggregated lists. So any other errors that are raised by other commands or in the endpoint itself will still get grouped together. Commands also give us the benefit of a middleware-like pipeline, which functions just about the same as a pipeline behavior in MediatR. Using a middleware here simply requires us to invoke the handler invoke the next delegate to run the handler code, and then we can run whatever code before or after the handler itself. So FastEndpoints also gives us a way to invoke those very same commands as background jobs. We have control over the degree of parallelism, maximum execution times, delayed starts and expiries. Given that these jobs are essentially just commands under the hood, they can still return a result if required, and we can also track the progress of these jobs. While it seems like we can just easily throw our existing commands into a job queue, these jobs are actually designed to be durable, so there is a little bit more setup required. So this still uses the exact same command as our previous example, with the only difference being that instead of invoking it directly with execute async, we're calling queueJobAsync. Now queueJobAsync simply adds the job to the queue and returns a tracking ID. And that tracking ID can be used to check the progress of the job or to cancel the job if required. The queue will then be responsible for executing the command in the background depending on how we've configured our parallelism, etc. If we do want to implement progress tracking, we need to inject an iJob tracker into our handler and have our command implement an iTrackable job interface. We then create a new job result where we can set the total number of steps, and from there we can update the current step as the job progresses, and finally we can set the result of that job. Now, as mentioned, these jobs are designed to be durable, and as this method indicates, we need to set up some way to store the jobs and their results. Outside of calling a job queue in our program.cs, we also need to implement a job storage record. This is a class that implements iJob storage record, which among a few other properties is used to store the job's tracking ID and the command itself. The get and set commands here are used to customize serialization of the command. So if we need to store the result of the job, we can also implement iJob results storage. Once we add this, we also need to provide a property for the result and implement the get and set result methods to handle serialization of the result. With our job storage record ready to persist, we need to implement a job storage provider. We really have our choice of persistence mechanism here, as long as we implement the iJob storage provider interface. So we can run this in memory if we want to, but this is going to be a requirement. Again, while these aren't all the methods that we need to implement, the ones that we'll actively use are along the lines of explicitly storing or cancelling jobs. And similar to the job record, if we need to store the result, we can also implement iJob result provider and implement those methods. So, fairly easy to get the background tasks up and running with just that bit of overhead to add some form of persistence. Sitting on top of gRPC for net, we can also easily allow for separate servers to handle our commands. Now, I've never really had to use gRPC myself at all, mostly just knowing that it was a thing out there that has been on the bucket list of things to go and learn about. However, it's been made pretty easy for us to implement, with FastEndpoints wrapping the implementation under, once again, our commands. There's a little more setup required, however, with each remote procedure needing to be registered individually. So I don't want to go into too much detail here as we're starting to get into the very problem-specific areas that these features address, but to cover this at a high level at least, we start with, once again, our command. And once again, all we need to do is change our method call, this time to remote execute async. We do need to tell FastEndpoints where to find the handler, which we do in our program.cs file. And over on the remote server, we need to register the handler for that command. So at a very high level, it's very simple to get up and running. And assuming that we've got that server running, we can treat that as almost like any other command in our code base. We can also handle events on a separate server as well, this time using the same iEvent and iEvent handler interfaces that we used for local events. By default, only the server can broadcast events, but can be configured to act as an event broker, relaying events to all subscribers or in a round-robin format for distributed workloads. Events are handled in memory by default, but we can apply a pattern similar to what we saw for the durable background jobs. Although at this point, it's probably worth considering using a dedicated message broker. So again, looking at this at a high level, so we won't go into the persistence side of things here. But over on our servers program.cs file, we register the event hub for our example event. And to actually send an event out to any listeners, we need to create an instance of that event and then call broadcast on it. That will notify any subscribers of the event, which are registered in each client's program.cs. Once that notification has been raised, then any handlers registered for that event will be invoked. Registering the server as an event broker is also quite easy to set up. Coming back to where we registered our event hub, we simply need to register that event with the hub mode set to event broker. This essentially means that now both the server and connected clients can raise events. And to achieve that, first we need to tell our client's program.cs to register the event as a remote procedure, and then it's as simple as calling remote publish async on the event somewhere in our client. That'll hit the event hub, which then sends it all out to all the subscribed clients. So getting close to the end now, server-sent events are another one that FastEndpoints makes easy. So if we need any live server-to-client communication, we can implement that just as easily as well. Using the send event stream async method, we can send that event stream over to the client, and we need to implement our get data stream method as well. That is essentially a method that returns an iasync enumerable of whatever it is that we want to send back. And then on the front end, we just need to create our event source and start listening for the events. And we should start seeing responses flowing back to the client over time. So the last thing I wanted to touch on here was the testing library that FastEndpoints provides. While we certainly don't need to use the library, it does cut down on the tedious nature of writing requests. And with tests often being missed altogether, making it as easy as possible it can only be a good thing. The biggest benefit I've found with this library personally is that it focuses on routeless testing. This allows us to use one of the many extension methods provided for the HTTP client. These methods accept endpoints and DTOs as arguments of type parameters and gives us the means to write our test without actually having to specify the route URL ourselves. It uses any annotations on the request DTOs properties to construct a HTTP request message with the data in the right place. For example, if we have a property with the from header attribute, the HTTP message will be constructed with that as a header in the request, instead of adding it to the JSON body. So just touching lightly on unit testing as well, the library does provide us with a factory to create instances of our endpoints, which we can easily throw mock dependencies into, so we can test the handler functionality directly as well. So there are a handful of other things that FastEndpoints looks to make easier for us, but I won't go into detail on those ones here. These include some things like easy route-based versioning of endpoints, caching, rate limiting, and scaffolding via .NET templates. There's also an open API generator that I haven't actually tried using myself, but that's an interesting option that we have. That said, it might give you a very good idea of how an existing solution might look in FastEndpoints without having to do a lot of legwork to understand how that feels. So personally, I've found FastEndpoints to really streamline building API endpoints. Even coming back to some older code, it's very easy to navigate and understand an API structure. It does away with the layers of indirection and abstractions that just make us think harder than we need to. It also cuts down on the areas of code that we might disagree on. Considerations around whether we should be returning anything from our commands or how we're communicating failure states back to the IPA all become moot. It's also very easy for us to get started with the basic implementation. Often I've seen the scaffolding of a backend to include an endpoint to prove some functionality, and we've already got queries and handlers flying around just to establish a pattern. That same endpoint in FastEndpoints can be a single endpoint with very little code attached to it. We don't need to go adding commands and handlers, mapping or exception handling middleware just to get started. Our complexity grows organically. Now, not to be all sunshine and rainbows, FastEndpoints really is best suited to building explicitly web APIs. If we need to invoke any business logic from different interfaces, function apps, background jobs, etc., then we might be better off still looking to decouple that application layer entirely. And that can in turn make the single endpoint per file approach that FastEndpoints suggests a little bit cumbersome, as we end up with a bunch of files that really just have one method call in them. So there definitely is a clear application of FastEndpoints, and when it's the right fit, it can feel very right. It's very easy to get started though, and throw together a few endpoints, so there's certainly no harm in spinning up a project and giving it a play today. Thanks. Any questions?
Plenty of time for questions, so go at it.
I noticed when you were showing off the data in that example, so
yep.
Those were provided by a property, I'm guessing, on the endpoint, and it's inferring that from the generic types. What happens if you've got, like, say, a data with two instances of data with the same generic types?
Was this when we're moving logic to that data class? That's essentially just us implementing that as a static. We can implement some static helper methods for that. I personally don't like it a whole lot. Like, I like seeing all that code directly in the handler, but the common approach seems to be move it out. I think personally it's just to make the examples look super concise, which is a big part of why I don't find I do that a lot.
They're just pure functions, right? So
yeah.
They can live at the bottom in the same file if you wanted.
Yeah. So it's really, conceptually, it's no different to using a repository pattern and calling it there. It's just, in this case, we're just moving that code right up next to the endpoint and accessing it from there. Cool.
I've got actually a couple. One for the event processing, command pressing, and remote stuff. Are there any integrations with existing message brokers, or is like just everything's in memory?
Yep. Sorry, I'm supposed to be repeating questions. Yep. So wondering if there are any integrations with the event and command processing. and not that I'm aware of. So a lot of that is just handled in memory. So I think a lot of this, it's certainly been designed for a certain use case. Like I think the threshold is if you have a big complex solution, it's probably not going to be the best fit. But where we're implementing that more standard API with kind of your events and commands being used in a lighter fashion, I think it's more targeted around that.
Yeah, the other question I had was around, so the documentation says that validators and mappers are registered as singletons, and if you're supposed to inject services there, you should resolve them from your DI container for performance reasons. But could you expand on that?
Yeah, so the question was around the validators and mappers being registered as singletons. Yeah, I found that one a little bit odd, to be honest. That's probably one where I've just followed the documentation as it's provided. But if we do need those services, they do provide a couple of methods to let us easily resolve those services and consume them there as need be.
No, the question is more why are singletons slower in case of scoped services are slower in case of fast endpoints.
Gotcha. Yep. Honestly, I don't know.
But there?
I think you could you register them as like instance per request or instance per dependency, and like do you have to have them as registered as singletons?
I think so. I haven't found a way. I haven't really looked, but I haven't found a way to register them differently at all.
Because my spidey sense would tell me the same thing as you. I would rather them to be
Scoped services.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, or just
Because they shouldn't have state.
well, that's the problem is if you can then introduce state, you end up with that singleton with state, it's a pattern, right? Yeah. So it's kind of like they're setting you up for failure by recommending singletons, I guess, if they can't stop you from carrying state. It's the example that he gave.
There's pretty a number of ways to implement something wrong. If you're doing your validators and your mappers with state, then maybe just don't do that.
Yeah, I think that's what he's
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah, but there are different situations and complex dependencies and scopes that probably need to be disposed to avoid leaking memory and such. So
Yeah. No, it's a very good point, and honestly, it's not something I had really considered too deeply. So I appreciate the.
I just never use singleton.
Yeah. Cool. Yes.
Just a quick one. Performance-wise, because I'm in the middle of facing out MediatR as well now.
Yep.
I'm looking at Wolverine and I'm looking at a couple of these other ones, and a lot of them they keep nagging on about whether it's reflection or if it's code generation under the hood. But do you know what this thing does? Does it use reflection or does it actually generate?
No, I think so. I'm scratching my brain right now. Sorry, the question was around whether it uses reflection.
I don't think it would use either in this situation.
It's a direct call.
It's just direct call.
what about the
One
No,
one scenario is mediator using reflection or cogeneration.
I can't remember, but I mean,
Yeah, so
stuff happening that you don't see, right? And it's probably just that initial registration where it looks for your handles and
That uses
Yeah.
reflection.
So-
that's just the one-off at the start of.
You don't need to use it either.
yeah, so I think I am just scratching my brain for memories around what I read in the documentation, but I believe it does use reflection, but there is a source generated option.
Yeah,
I could be completely wrong on that, but I do think I recall reading something around that.
Over the lifetime HTTP, you have the choice for serialization, deserialization using reflection or cogeneration.
Kind of off the back of that, and probably inform the answer to the previous question, does it support trimming and native AOT?
The question around trimming and native AOT, and
Yeah,
if it is,
time features, like a lot of
Yeah.
the libraries, they just won't work.
They break when you enable it.
yeah, I haven't tried it myself, but yeah, the fact that I'm quite sure it does use some reflection at least out of the box, which
there is a
tells
file
me
in the
probably
repo
not.
called reflectiongenerator.cs.
Might be some reflection on that one.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I would certainly be happy to give it a shot, but I couldn't tell you if that's supported right now. My gut instinct is no.
It's still, you can still
Any other questions? Outside of, is there any meat lovers pizza left?
Was there a meat lovers to begin with?
No, I didn't see one actually on.
If you need a bit more extra motivation for questions, especially our first-time attendees, our tradition is our speaker will get to choose one of the questions and give away a JetBrains license, and you can use it for any of their products, their ID, ReSharp, or any of their tooling. So if you've been sitting on a question,
And you want a free license for 12 months. There should be two in there. Is there two in there?
is that too?
Is there another
You
piece of
only get
paper?
one.
I've lost one. Sorry, there should be two.
Matt, was that your hand going up for a question the second
Sorry?
the second something was on offer?
I'll let my rider license.
End up just like this.
Yeah.
I'll give you one later.
Shoot. What are you up to?
If no one else is going to ask a question, I was going to say that you started off the talk basically saying that this offers a more clear separation and of your application and your domain logic, but I don't feel like I really fully understood how you demonstrated that.
Yep. No,
So what I did see is that you were accessing like domain entities, what looked like directly into that handle that also was used for concerns around mapping HTTP requests. And for me, that's not something I would ever want to do because like have classical fileables layers, and maybe that's more about vertical slice architecture. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that so I can understand.
yeah. This probably touches on, actually, I was having a conversation with Syed before, and there's I find it funny because there's a lot of the things that that most people would just assume is kind of general knowledge that I guess I kind of missed out on being somewhat new to the career as well. So we're talking about, I didn't find out until about a year ago that you could right-click deploy from Visual Studio. I thought it all came from pipelines and the CLI was an option.
That's a good misunderstanding.
Yeah. And I think that's, so kind of related to that, like it's one of those things where I've kind of landed in the career, and right off the bat, it was a lot of files going everywhere and with these handlers. And what I found was I was quite often going, where is this code supposed to go? Is it application code? Is it presentation code? Is it domain code? And I found myself getting quite lost. And more often than not, it would all just end up getting shoved into the handlers. And generally, I'd see that kind of decision making from everybody across the team just lead to a really scattered code base. And truth be told, I think going back to that more traditional architecture, if it's done 100% well, it's probably better. But very, very rarely have I seen that be the case. And so that's where I feel like this approach just simplifies things to the point where you're not having to make those decisions. You're not having to think too hard about where does this and where does that go. And that surface area for disagreement goes away. So even if your way is 90% there and somebody else's is 90% there, if they don't align, you're going to disagree, and you start seeing that fraying of the code base as well. So that's where I find it helps to really clarify those boundaries, because we start looking at code, and if you look at a handler that has what now feels a bit more obvious domain logic in there, you almost get a sense of revulsion. You're going, that just should not be in there, get it out of that handler. So yes, while you're probably right in that it possibly does murky the waters a little bit, I feel like it also helps create that separation just through its simplicity. Yeah.
I actually have two questions. The first one is, are you able to demonstrate a little bit about the security, for example, permissions, authorizations? And the second one is, how about the API versioning for FastEndpoints? You know, in traditional way, when we build these APIs, you've got lots of endpoints in your controller with one file. Now you basically say, instead of one controller, you have 11 files for one for each endpoint. Then when you apply all those versions and stuff, do you do that like one by one within the endpoints, or you did a better pattern to do?
Yep. So question was just around versioning. I'll come back to the other question as well.
Yeah.
That one, personally, I haven't actually held that myself. I tend to move on from projects before I get to the point where I have a V2. It's very fleeting interest that I have. But my understandings were more around you can mark endpoints as, so yes, you still have individual endpoints, but you can tell it what you want as like the prefix for your versioning, and you can mark them as deprecated after a certain time and to essentially just no longer be active after another release version. So you can go through and mark them. Unfortunately, I can't give you any great examples because I, one, haven't used it myself, so I'm just regurgitating some documentation here. And the other one around authorization and security.
Yeah, security.
Yep, so I don't have any examples on hand, but that's all handled essentially through that configure method that we override. There's pretty much a bunch of helper methods in there, so any sort of policies or authentication, we can just reference it all in there. It's pretty easy. Yep. Yeah, so in our, there are a few, so when it comes to our processes, et cetera, we can register them as global processes, or we can apply some global we can globally impact every endpoint through our program.cs. There's like an endpoint configurator, and that will apply to all of them. So, so where we saw that allow anonymous that I passed in for that endpoint, typically especially when I'm playing around, I don't want to have to do that for every endpoint. So in my endpoint configurator, I just slap and allow anonymous, and that applies to every endpoint. More number of questions doesn't make you closer to the prize.
Sorry, maybe an obvious question, but I've seen you use this for presentations before, and I keep forgetting to ask what it is, and maybe everyone knows what it is, but I don't know what it is.
It's actually the first time I've used this one for presentations. Again, with my fleeting interests, I've been bouncing around them. Now this one's slide dev.
Slide dev.
Yep.
Okay, sweet.
Yep. Which was good fun until I had to start dragging boxes around, and then it wasn't fun anymore. But I was already too committed, so I had to keep going. Yep. No, it was good. I was probably just making it a lot harder than it needed to be.
Up until the value adds with the command and queue stuff, honestly, how much is it actually just a wrapper around endpoint, route builder, and that minimal APIs?
Yeah, quite a lot. It is essentially just a bunch of helper methods there. One of the things I like, however, and at that point, if you're just using it, like if you could have just done it all in minimal API and would have been pretty simple, I probably would lean away from bringing in an extra dependency. But I do kind of like the pit that it creates for you to fall into, I guess, just with that single file. You've got your endpoint and your handler, and then honestly, even if it comes just to removing an endpoint, that's one thing that's caused me tons of pain in the past. Like you delete an endpoint, and then you've got handlers, and you can't remember if they've registered to anything, so you're constantly checking references to things. Whereas in this case, if it's all just in one folder, you just delete the folder and the endpoint's gone. And so yes, it is a nice wrapper, but if you're not using those extra bells and whistles, it isn't much more than that. Oh, sorry, Todd beat you to the punch.
Sorry. When using your IDE, I don't know what IDE you use, whether you use VS Code or VS or Rider or whatever, but what I always found difficult with the naming convention that you showed on the early slides, where it's like just get user in a folder, and then it's like endpoint.
Yeah.
Then you go like command N or user awesome bar, and then you go like, you type in endpoint, and you got like 1,000 endpoints, and like which endpoint's which, and then you got to look at the path, which is like, and then how do you find the navigation with that naming convention? Is my question.
Yep. So
good or bad? Or?
Question around the naming convention of having all of our endpoints called endpoint, with the folder being the discriminator. Personally, I've probably gotten accustomed to that a lot using SvelteKit. So that has a similar naming convention. It's probably why I didn't find it too unappeasing when I went to this, because that's similar. You've just got like a...
IDE good enough now that it doesn't matter?
Yeah, I found generally it's more a change in the way I'm searching for things. So I use VS Code, and generally it's just include part of the folder name in the search. Very easy to still bring it up. VS Code also has a setting where you can, I think you show part of the folder inside the file name, so that helps too, especially when you've got a bunch of them open and you just see endpoint listed across. Yeah, you're not switching tabs. So yeah, IDE can help you out, but that's one of the things where we can call as endpoints whatever we really want. It's just one of those things where I like not having to think, what am I going to call this endpoint? It's just called endpoint.
Yes, so I've got the option to add more information into the class name, obviously, is what you're saying.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sorry, jump to that
Yep.
gentleman.
You said you've been working with FastEndpoints for a while now. Is there anything that you think it's missing, or anything that you wish that it did?
So, question around whether I think there's anything FastEndpoints is missing, and nothing really comes to mind. But actually, again, I keep talking to Saib. I was talking to Saib earlier, and one of the things that really got me intrigued with this was thinking back over the projects that I've worked on for the last 5 years or so, and really I think everything that I needed to do on the back end, I think about 80% of it could have been covered by what FastEndpoints has out of the box. And I've had to go and learn different technologies where if I was using something like FastEndpoints, it's made pretty simple to implement. So don't know if it's really missing anything, but at the same time, I feel like it's got a good number of features, and I'd rather use it for those and not see things just constantly added to it and just sort of dilute the value that it does bring. Oh, sorry. Oh no, yeah, why am I pointing at you? You can wait.
Yeah, just wondering, like the community behind this. Will this thing go commercial in 3 years? And I am very good question.
Yep. So question around whether it's going to go commercial, and actually I had some thing in there. I was going to mention that's obviously just a risk that is carried with any library, and that's why if I was just using it as a simple wrapper, I'd probably lean away from it, because there's every chance that it could go commercial at some point. At least the creator behind it has expressed an intent to keep it free. Just like MediatR. So yeah, so I take that with I take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, I actually thought about getting a shirt made up to where he's saying it'll always be free. And
There are worse options than going commercial, right? Like it could be like Nancy FX and get kind of abandoned. And
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Like, you know, is it like one guy running this thing, like Jimmy Borgard with MediatR, or is there like a bunch?
there's one main developer. There are quite a few people have contributed to it, but yeah, there really is just one main person behind it. Yeah. Yes, again.
On the handle method for the request.
Yep.
If I'm not mistaken, it has like a void task return, and you're actually completing the request by callback method.
How do you mean by callback method?
So you were demonstrating before
Yep.
that I await this like a OK response and give it the body.
Yep.
But the signature is just task. It's not a task of T. And so it's not actually returning anything there, but it's completing the request. And you commented that after you did that callback, because that's a callback method, or a delegate.
Yep. Yeah.
That you can't actually execute anything after it.
So you can actually execute code after it.
Yeah.
It just won't complete the request. So that's where I sort of ran into some trouble. It's really weird. I can't really explain really what happened. I just know it didn't work.
Yeah, it seems like a strange design.
Yeah, and that's why I prefer using that pattern when I'm just doing work for myself, but I feel that if I was working on this in a team, I would prefer to use the execute async method, which requires a return.
Okay, so
Yeah.
there is an option to actually
Yeah.
return.
Yeah,
Okay.
and yeah, if I was working with a bunch of other people, especially if I had some juniors in the team, and that's really it. You want to keep that guardrail around. Typically,
Guardrail, it just feels like a very strange design choice, that's all.
It is, but it does lead to that nice expressive kind of code. Like it's very simple to read through that, and yeah, so you can add code after it. Like I was logging something after the request was completed. Actually, that's where I was looking at it, and I realized it wasn't working was because I had a log line to say the request had been completed. It was only when I was debugging it and I landed on that line and I went to check the response and went, that's not actually returned what I expected it to until I completed the entire handler block. But no, that line was still logged though. So you can still add code that happens after it, but it gets into a bit of a weird state. And that's why I probably would just lean towards the execute async if it wasn't just my own personal work. Yes?
alternative to middleware that you had the pre and post handlers that put
Yep.
everything into the state object.
Yep.
Is that state object something that gets pushed off into the bells and whistles follow-on things that you talked about, or is it still all manual
That's
handling?
yeah, that's pretty much just we create our own state bag and add to it, and that's where I found it felt a bit clunky. Because I was kind of like, I get to, oh, you mean I can just, if I need a user, I can go look up their data from the database and just hand that straight off to the endpoint.
Is there a reason why you wouldn't just have a scope for the request DI object to maintain across, or does it not pass between the pre, post, and endpoint phases?
No, that's consistent across all those phases. Yep.
And your DI scope is consistent across all those phases as well?
Can't answer that actually. I've not really looked into it. That's one that I sort of just took at face value and went, that's nice, but it's also yuck at the same time.
Because often with middleware, sometimes there's parts of the middleware pipeline that are outside of the lifetime, request lifetime, and some of parts of the middleware are in the lifetime, and you get this weird kind of
But that's why I was wondering if
barrier point
the
is what
state
you're
was
talking about, right?
intended to follow off as opposed to using DI in that thing. But yeah.
The state just sounds like a context. You could just use H3 context the same way.
Pretty much. It makes me think of like Redux and Flux and stuff a bit, but it's not.
Well, now you're going to turn everyone off it.
Sorry, I shouldn't mention any of those things. Sorry, I hijacked your question.
No, that's all good.
I've got another one if no one else has one.
Shoot, Todd.
So, when you got down to the distributed systems bit at the end, and then there was like the durability part where it was persisting a shape that carried the data for the asynchronous operation, and then it had like, it persisted like a response or something. Do you remember? You know,
Yep.
I'm new to this, so if I say the wrong thing, you can correct me. It was weird because there was no types there. You were like returning object or nullable of object, and then like, can you make that type safe? And
Yeah, I
you know
think.
what I mean? Like the example was like there's some places that didn't have good type safety, and that was
Yeah, that's probably some good feedback actually, because I think I was just keeping it quite generic when I was putting the examples
so
together.
That's just your example, but you're not restricted to pushing an object into a
Yeah.
store somewhere.
Yeah, and that's where we have those methods too to serialize and deserialize it. So that's a bit that we care about more than what that. I mean, obviously we care about what that object is, but that's a bit that it really just needs to make sure that's consistent. We should be right.
Yeah, I guess if it's object, who knows what it is, right?
Yeah.
But I know,
Yeah.
I know what you're saying.
Cool. Yes.
FastEndpoint seems to market itself as being faster with things like faster startup. Have you been able to validate that or even see any difference?
I haven't, but at the same time, I haven't used it to the extent that I've done a lot of my professional work, so I don't really have the baseline usage with FastEndpoints to really compare them. They do have some benchmarks on their website, but of course they're on their website, so believe them if you will.
Against minimal, right?
Yeah, it's their benchmarks pretty much put it between minimal API and our old controllers, old MVC. So yeah, it's and that's it. Like that's where I think the fast comes from. It's fast to implement a new endpoint more so than it runs faster. It is built on top of minimal API though, so it gets all those performance benefits as well. You can wait, Todd. Yeah.
What wouldn't you use it for?
So as I mentioned before, I think if it was anything outside the scope of just a straightforward web API, so the second we start wanting to invoke any of that logic from the, like, if we've got background tasks or we've got function apps that are calling that logic, that's where I think decoupling that application layer is going to make a lot more sense. And I think once we do that, we lose a lot of the benefit that we get from fast endpoints. So we're going to end up with a file that just has a bunch of configuration and then hand that off to something else. I think it's just going to get annoying over time to try and manage that. You're going, why do I have a million different files now? I'd rather have a single file that has all of these routes and just invokes them. I think also, speaking from more of a professional sense, I don't know if I'd bring it in for a project where the scope was really unknown. If this could just grow, or there was potential for it to grow into a solution where wasn't any longer just that straightforward web API, that's probably where I'd say, nah, I don't want to risk it. And that's more, I haven't used it to that extent yet, so I don't know if I trusted that far just yet. Sorry, Todd, do you want to go, or? No.
Do you still have access to like the underlying HTTP request context? Like,
Yes.
is it exposed by property, such as
Yeah, you should do. I haven't done it a whole lot, but I know in that response interceptor, for example, that's one of the areas where we can access that and we can manipulate that as much as we need to.
on the endpoint?
The endpoint.
Endpoint.
Would just be a property on the endpoint based on this, right?
Yeah, I think we can. I can't answer that with 100% certainty, but
You can
think so.
access that through the processors.
Yeah, I'm thinking more the endpoint.
Luke's saying yes.
yep. Thank you. Yep.
Just, sorry for the slightly weird question, but you mentioned it was middle or something, was the previous API and if you're wanting to move away from. What's this? How long has Fast been around for in a like usable state? And how fast is the turnover for these kind of APIs or these kind of libraries?
So the question was around the lifespan of FastEndpoints. I haven't actually looked into how long it's been around. I have seen a lot of discussion around it going back a couple of years, a bit over a couple of years ago.
Version 1 came out in 2021.
There we go. Thank you. Yeah, and interestingly, one of the when I was looking into it and trying to gauge its viability, I came across a Reddit thread where people were discussing it, and somebody came back and asked after a year, how are you finding it? And the response from that person, at least, was saying that it was still very positive and they really enjoyed using it. So, and that's with a year of development under there. I don't know how big that solution was. It was just a bit of a comment thread, but
Just 2 endpoints.
yeah.
So in the whole year.
Yeah. Sorry, Todd, you keep sticking your hand up.
I just, like, I could ask 100 questions and I don't want to monopolise the questions like that.
I have a question.
Yeah, jump in. My question is about I'm calling it middleware, and I don't know if that's the right terminology, so correct me if that's wrong, but the middleware stuff, and then you had the property bag where you that carried across the request and then pre and post request and response. How do you then reuse that middleware across different endpoints where they then take dependencies on these custom property bags that have a different shape for every endpoint, or am I missing understanding what's happening?
Yeah, and that's where I found the whole state management side of that, or that whole state bag, to be a little bit weird, and just because you're going to end up with, like, I really wanted to implement a processor that grabbed a user, and I could just throw that preprocessor at any endpoint, and then that endpoint would have the user, right? And that's actually where I went, I don't know what this is trying to achieve, because I was like, I want to be able to just plug that in and then plug a different preprocessor in.
Or say, you had 20 API endpoints for one, logical domain object or whatever, and you wanted a preprocessor over those 20 endpoints, but not the other 80 in your own.
Yeah. So yeah, that's where I found that quite clunky. Like there's no way to just kind of plug in different bits of state and then use it. And yeah, if you're expecting that to be there for a post processor, and it wasn't initialized in your preprocessor, then yeah, it's just not going to be there. So.
And then you obviously then you want to have like a closure over parts of the state and stuff. Anyway, I don't want to get too bogged down, but
yeah, it's probably
it wasn't clear to me how it solves that problem. I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and
Have global post and preprocessors.
Yeah, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about not local and not global, but in between. You know what I mean? Because like.
Yeah, but that's the way I guess that FastEndpoints solves that. You just implement your own conditional logic on selecting whether you process something or not.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah,
within
right.
that processor.
So you make it global and then ignore it for everything but one collection of endpoints, is what you're saying.
For example.
Configure naturally, you can say just add processor. So if you have 20, you can say add.
Okay.
Add processor.
so you can opt into something. I guess I'll talk about it later. Won't keep everyone here all night.
Processes are also singletons.
You have access to the scope dependencies though.
Through service resolution.
Yeah. So if you
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk a bit about after why do you need to cache? Why would you cache the processes? It's effectively what they're doing, right? Keeping them in memory. Anyway.
Yes.
Have you been vibe coding at all with FastEndpoints? Any way to do
No,
it?
no. I have had one attempt at genuinely vibe coding. I went in with a clear intent to do it, and I couldn't. I hated it. So no, I don't vibe code at all. I haven't really used it with FastEndpoints. So I guess if the question is more, does AI play nicely with it?
Yeah.
I can't really answer that because
I was hoping so, like, whether you guys have a bit of a simple scope, like, and especially like you said, if the project has like defined scope, it should translate well.
Yeah. So yes, unfortunately, I can't answer that because I feel like I hold AI differently or wrong. No, I've found a lot of the way I use it tends to be very targeted. So I'd be, yeah, especially with something, I guess with something as concise as FastEndpoints, and this has probably been my experience with SvelteKit as well, is because there's so little code to write, I get less value in using AI for these things. More often than not, it just generates code I don't want, and if I only needed to add 20, 30 lines, I may as well have just written it. Yeah.
Appreciate that, thank you.
No worries.
I'm not really answering this question, but the fact that it's been out since 2021 means that it'll probably be in the training data sets for most of the LLMs, so you might have a chance. Yeah. Not like if they shipped it last week, you'd be in big trouble.
Yes, just like Svelte 5. That's the other reason why I haven't used AI a whole lot, because what I use at home was not part of the training data. So that's been fun. It's led me down a path of fine tuning, which has fizzled out. Anyway, any other questions before we wrap up? Cool. I'm thirsty.
Any favourite questions?
Favorite questions, and for also being live documentation. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yes, I'm still sore from cricket training. I went back to cricket this week and I can hardly walk, so pick the right seat. All right, I'm going to unplug then. Thanks, everyone.
All right, that's it. Everyone, next month we've got a talk on AI. It's already been published on the meetup, as you've probably seen in the last few days. Would love to see you all there if it's something that interests you. The other thing is, chasing speakers is the hardest thing about running a user group. And so if you've seen, it's a pretty friendly group. Yeah, there's lots of questions, and so you might get some hard questions that you don't know the answers to. It happened to Isaac a couple of times tonight. It doesn't matter. You just say, I don't know the answer if you don't know the answer, right?
If you don't want questions, don't invite Matt.
We'll just ban Matt after tonight. It's fine. Matt's my very close friend, so I can tease him hopefully and get away with it in public. So please, if you've got something that you're really passionate about, if you've got something that you've been using, don't steal my mic, please.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Just so the people on the stream will hopefully also get the message and propose talks. But please, 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 even if it's 5 minutes on the latest NuGet package that you love to work with, that you just found out about, that changed your life, anything up to like an hour or an hour and a half is fine. Probably past an hour and a half, people will start falling asleep on a Thursday night. So don't want to, massive workshops or anything. But other than that, and anything that's .NET related at all, please, 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 please propose it. And if you want some feedback or you want to practice it, I'm happy to do a Teams call on the weekend and you can run through your talk with me and I can give you feedback. So yeah, and that's what keeps the user group going, is if people are willing to put their hands up and provide talks, 5 minutes, 1 minute, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, doesn't matter. So, and then please tell your friends and encourage your smart friends who want a safe place to present before they go to YOW or they go to DDD or they go to something else. Maybe they come along and present something. Yeah. And I just thank the sponsors again. Thanks Sayeb and Versant. Thank you Isaac again, our speaker, also from Versant. And thank you JetBrains. We only had one. I've got 2 at home, JetBrains, but I only brought 1 with me somehow. So I'll give out 3 next month. So come back next month and you'll have 3 times as much chance of winning a free license. Thanks very much. Cheers.